Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here today. I'm David Luchs, Marquee Team Lead at Ballotpedia. The first primaries of the 2022 election cycle will take place in Texas next Tuesday, March 1st. This year, 34 seats in the U.S. Senate and all 435 U.S. House districts are up for election. Control of both chambers is at stake. There are also dozens of state executive offices on the ballot this year, along with 84% of state legislative seats across the country. Even year general elections always get a lot of attention, but so much of the action happens during the primaries, which decide who makes the general election ballot from each major party. Along with our election articles on ballotpedia.org, one of the main places we're covering primary elections is our weekly newsletter, The Heart of the Primaries. Here to talk with me about that and about emerging themes in the midterm primaries is Marquee Team staff writer Amée LaTour. Hi, Amée. Thanks for being here.
Hi, David. Thanks for having me.
So before we jump into the big primary stories of the year so far, tell us a little about the Heart of the Primaries newsletter. What can people find there?
So every week we send two versions of this newsletter, one with stories about Democratic primaries and the other about Republican primaries. People can subscribe to one or both of those, and each issue has recent news about primaries. So things like big endorsements, polls, candidates entering races or dropping out. But really the overall goal is to distill conflicts within each major party. So the policy differences and other debates between candidates, office holders, and groups that are trying to take the parties in certain directions. We mostly cover primaries for Congress, state executives, state legislatures, but really any interesting primary related stories that catch our eye are fair game. So the newsletter covers a pretty broad territory.
Right, and speaking of broad territory, Texas. We've had a lot of stories about the upcoming primaries there running in Heart of the Primaries. Could you tell us about some of the interesting issues that have been coming out of Texas's primaries this year?
Sure. So one of the big races we've been following there is the Democratic primary rematch between Representative Henry Cuellar and Jessica Cisneros in the 28th Congressional District. Cuellar won the 2020 primary by about 4 percentage points. He's a member of the Blue Dog Coalition, which is a House caucus that says it supports fiscal responsibility and a strong national defense. And last September, Cuellar was the only Democrat in the House to vote against a bill to legalize abortion on the federal level.
And abortion policy has been a big topic of conversation, both in Texas and nationally, since the state restricted abortions after what the new law calls a detectable fetal heartbeat. The Supreme Court was involved in that ongoing legal challenge, and the court is now also considering another abortion restriction law out of Mississippi.
Yes, and positions on abortion have been an issue in the 28th district race. We did a story on that toward the end of last year. Cisneros and another candidate in the same primary, Tanya Benavides, held an event together on Instagram talking about their opposition to that bill. And Cisneros is an immigration attorney. She supports legalized abortion and Medicare for all as well.
Now, we also had an interesting story come up in this race about the Build Back Better bill, didn't we?
We did, yes. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was in Texas recently campaigning for Cisneros and another congressional candidate from the 35th district, and she brought up Build Back Better. Cuellar was one of 9 House Democrats last summer who said he wouldn't support the budget resolution needed to pass that bill if the House didn't vote on the infrastructure bill first. He did end up supporting the resolution, which included a non-binding agreement to vote on the infrastructure bill in September. That vote didn't end up happening at that time, but the House did eventually vote on the infrastructure bill first in November, and then Build Back Better later that month. And both of those bills passed in the House with Cuellar's support.
Right, and most members of the Congressional Progressive Caucus initially said they wouldn't vote on the infrastructure bill until after the Senate passed Build Back Better. We may see these issues come up in other primaries throughout the year. Switching gears a little bit, how about the GOP primary for governor in Texas? Governor Greg Abbott is running for re-election, and he has a few challengers this year.
Yes, and one of the big issues in that race has been Abbott's handling of the coronavirus pandemic. Earlier in the pandemic, he put in place a statewide mask mandate and some restrictions on businesses. And last year, he lifted those and prevented local governments from putting in place their own mandates and restrictions. But at least a couple of his challengers, Don Huffines and Alan West, have been criticizing him for those early restrictions, in addition to some other things, and saying that Abbott isn't conservative enough for the state.
And I saw Donald Trump endorsed Abbott in that primary. Let's talk a little about the former president's involvement in Republican primaries this year. Where else is he endorsing?
Well, so far we've tracked more than 100 endorsements from Trump in this year's elections, and that includes some primary challenges to a number of Republican incumbents. We've been covering some of those primaries a lot so far, like in Georgia, where Trump and Governor Brian Kemp clashed around the legitimacy of the 2020 presidential election results. And we've been covering some US House primaries as well, where incumbents either voted for impeachment last year or were critical of Trump in some other ways.
Right. And aside from endorsements, we recently had a story about some ways that Trump was shaping or trying to shape candidate fields.
Yeah, so we saw that in Georgia. Vernon Jones dropped out of the gubernatorial primary to run for House instead after he met with Trump, and Trump endorsed his House bid after that. Bernie Moreno withdrew from the Senate primary in Ohio, saying that Trump had asked him to drop out because there were too many pro-Trump candidates in that race. And in North Carolina, Mark Walker said that Trump had asked him to run for House instead of Senate, but Walker did decide to stay in the Senate race there.
Well, interesting. Now, have we seen any pushback or counter efforts to Trump's influence?
Yes. One is that an affiliate of the Republican Governors Association ran an ad supporting Brian Kemp in Georgia. Trump endorsed David Perdue in that race. It's not unusual that the RDA would back an incumbent. That's what it does. But this was the first time it ran an ad supporting an incumbent who's facing a primary challenge. The ad didn't mention Perdue, though. It focused on criticizing Biden and talking Kemp up.
Yes, and the RGA spent $500,000 on that TV ad, which they put out just a few days after Perdue released an ad featuring Trump. Any other interesting counter efforts?
Yeah, one other I'll mention is Maryland Governor Larry Hogan, who's a Republican. He's been saying that he thinks Trump's involvement in these races where he's going against incumbent Republicans is harmful to the party. And Hogan's been campaigning for some of these incumbents, like Kemp in Georgia and Amy Herrera Butler, who's a US representative in Washington, who voted for impeachment after the Capitol breach on January 6th last year.
Right. And there's a governor's race in Maryland this year, but Hogan is term limited, so he's not running for re-election. He and Trump endorsed different candidates in that GOP primary. And Hogan said recently that he's considering a presidential run in 2024. And Trump has also said, of course, that he's considering running again.
Right. Yeah. And we expect these debates over the direction of the Republican Party and over Trump's influence in it to continue throughout the primaries this year. And they could very well extend through 2024's elections as well.
All right. Well, shifting gears a bit, we can't really have a briefing on the 2022 primaries without talking a little bit about redistricting. So after the 2020 census, states have been redrawing congressional and state legislative district boundaries to account for population changes. Now that's resulted in some incumbents who are running against other incumbents. And we currently have 5 US House primaries where incumbents are running against each other. Is that right?
Yes, so far, and there could be more. So as of yesterday, 7 states hadn't finished redistricting. But as of now, there are 3 Democratic primaries and 2 Republican primaries where this is happening. And it's not because incumbents have to run for US House in the districts they live in. Some just choose to do so. So if their home gets drawn into a new district, they might run there. They might also decide to switch districts if the partisan makeup in their current district changes in a way that might hurt their reelection chances.
Right. And I see we have a table here of all the House primaries with incumbents who are facing each other so far. I know we've done several stories in the primaries newsletter on these races.
Yes, and some of those touch on themes that we talked about earlier, like Georgia's 7th district, where Build Back Better has come up since Representative Carolyn Bourdeaux was one of the Democrats, along with Henry Cuellar, who had argued for voting on the infrastructure bill before considering Build Back Better. And Lucy McBath was not in that group of Democrats. And in Illinois' 15th, Trump endorsed Mary Miller, and CNN had reported that House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy asked Trump not to get involved there if there ended up being an incumbent versus incumbent primary.
So it's safe to say Build Back Better is a theme in Democratic primaries, and Trump's involvement is a theme in Republican primaries. What are some other debates and conflicts that we might expect to see throughout the year?
Well, I think we'll see arguments around pandemic responses come up in a lot of different ways and in both parties' primaries. Like we saw with the governor's race in Texas, there'll be debates about restrictions and vaccine and mask mandates. We could also see discussions of things like eviction moratoriums that actually came up in New York's Democratic gubernatorial primary recently when Governor Kathy Hochul let the moratorium expire, and candidate Jumaane Williams criticized her for that.
And another issue we'll probably continue to see being discussed on the Democratic side is the debate about healthcare that's been happening now for several election cycles, and now particularly through the lens of the pandemic. So arguments about Medicare for all versus a public option, or other ways or other ideas about the best way to get everyone covered. How about issues beyond the pandemic?
Well, to name just a few, there's also the debate about how race is discussed in classrooms. The term critical race theory is something we'll probably hear a lot, both in school board races and in state executive races for governor, for example. And approaches to crime and police reform, debates about that really picked up after George Floyd's death in 2020, and those are definitely ongoing.
Right. I saw recently that House Speaker Nancy Pelosi said the Democratic Party's position is not defund the police. And some Democratic lawmakers and candidates have expressed support for that position, defund the police.
Yes, Representative Cori Bush in Missouri recently said she stands by that position, and that the party should work to explain what it means better. And Pelosi was responding to that.
Lots of important issues both parties are debating, both between and within themselves. I also want to make sure that we talk about Alaska. It is the only state that is holding top 4 primaries. This is a change that's going into effect for the first time this year. So under this system, every primary candidate for a given office will be on the same ballot, regardless of their partisan affiliation. The top 4 candidates in the primary will then go on to the general election, and the general election will have ranked choice voting. So a lot to unpack here. Could you explain for us how that works?
Sure. So for general elections for Congress, state executives, and state legislature, voters can rank their preferences among the candidates who advance from the top 4 primary. And a candidate needs a simple majority of the vote, which is 50% plus 1, to be declared the winner of an election. And if no candidate gets that majority on the first round of vote counting, the candidate with the fewest votes would be eliminated. And the people who voted for that candidate as their first choice would have their votes redistributed to their second choices. And that process would go on until there were 2 candidates left. And the candidate with the greatest number of votes at that point would win.
Wow, that's interesting enough on its own, but we have some really big elections happening in Alaska this year. Republican Senator Lisa Murkowski is seeking re-election. She has quite a few primary challengers. There's also Republican Governor Mike Dunleavy, who's running for re-election to a second term. One of the candidates who he'll be facing off against is Bill Walker, who was the independent governor before Dunleavy. So that's going to be a very interesting primary to watch as well.
Definitely. Yeah. And we'll be watching those closely to see how those top 4 primaries shake out and how the ranked choice voting process goes in November.
Definitely. So before we sign off today, we invited folks to submit questions ahead of today's call. And I have a question in front of me that's actually right in line with what we were just talking about. So with Alaska's top 4 primaries happening for the first time this year, what are some other states that have unusual types of primaries?
Well, as we said, Alaska is the only state with top 4, but there are a couple states with top 2, California and Washington. So in both of those states, just like in Alaska, candidates of all party affiliations run in the same primary, but only the top 2 candidates go to the general election in those 2 states. So in all of those states, you can have candidates of the same party in the general election.
Right. And that's also true of Louisiana, but they do things a little differently. Louisiana has its first election in November, where candidates of all affiliations run on the same ballot. The top 2 candidates advance to a second election only if nobody gets more than 50% of the vote in that first election. So that's the difference between Louisiana's system versus California or Washington. They don't have that majority threshold. So even if a primary candidate gets a majority in those states, they'll still have to face whoever got the second most votes in a general election.
Exactly. Yeah. And because Louisiana has that threshold, we call that a majority vote system instead of just a top 2 primary system.
Well, Amée, this has been a great overview of the midterm primaries so far and the Heart of the Primaries newsletter in particular. Thank you for being on today.
Yeah. Thanks a lot for having me.
And thanks to Lauren, our communications associate, for the presentation that was a part of today's briefing. We had a lot of material to cover, so we apologize for not getting to more of your questions. If you have any questions that we weren't able to get to, you can email editor@ballotpedia.org and we'll get you an answer for those. I also want to remind you that we at Ballotpedia rely on donations for all that we do. So if you like our work and want to support us, please consider donating by going to www.ballotpedia.org/donate to see the ways that you can contribute and make our coverage possible. If you registered for today's briefing, we'll send you a YouTube link to a recording of the presentation that you can share with friends or use to watch this webinar again. Finally, we have pages on ballotpedia.org covering each individual election within our coverage scope, and you can find in-depth information on each marquee election there throughout the year. And of course, the Heart of the Primaries newsletter is the place to find the week's biggest news and follow trends in each major party across several different races. You can subscribe to that newsletter at ballotpedia.org/the Heart of the Primaries. Also check out our other newsletters like the Daily Brew, which features 3 major political stories every weekday, along with newsletters dedicated to ballot measures, the federal courts, school board politics, and more. You can find a list at ballotpedia.org/ballotpedia email updates. Thanks a lot for being here with us.